Once again, we appreciate everyone being here today. So before we get started, my name is John Lyttle. I am an agriculture and local foods agent for Cooperative Extension in Durham County, and I am here with,
Melissa Bell. I'm the Center for Environmental Farming Systems Field Research Liaison.
and we've got a good presentation for you all today. Melissa is going to get started, and then I will plan on jumping in again in a little while. So thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them. So I'm going to start off the outline for today. We're going to be talking about blueberries, caneberries, which includes blackberries and raspberries, strawberries and grapes. We will discuss site considerations, growing conditions, planting and trellising, fertilizing, pruning, and general maintenance. And then, as we usually do, we'll touch on pests and pathogens and point you to some really great resources that can go more in depth about these fruit pests and pathogens. So, starting off with blueberries, our blueberries are deciduous woody perennials. They're pollinated by insects. Blueberries need a very specific environment. So, blueberries, unlike most other plants, are acid loving. They need a low pH, like 4.5. And they need full sun. They will tolerate shade, but your yield is going to decrease as your shade increases. But so low pH and good drainage are key to growing blueberries. You'll hear rabbit eye varieties and high bush varieties. So the rabbit eye varieties are native to the southeast. They're more drought and heat tolerant. They tolerate a wider range of soils, and they grow best in our Piedmont and coastal plain. They ripen later in the season, and they're generally more disease resistant. They require cross-pollination, so you need to plant two different varieties of your rabbit eye blueberries. Now, high bush varieties are for colder climates. Southern high bush varieties have been bred to be good for our mountain climates. So they grow better in colder climates. All blueberries have chilling hour requirements. Those for, rabbit eye varieties are lower than the ones southern high bush, and then the high bush varieties have the most time requirements for chilling. The southern high bush tend to be early ripening, so they're often the choice for commercial growers. Um, they self-pollinate, but they will benefit from cross-pollination as well. They tend to be higher maintenance than rabbit eyes, and they're more prone to a spring frost because they are, ripening earlier. So we're going to talk mostly about rabbit eye varieties, but so with the rabbit eyes, you need to plant two different varieties. The pollen of blueberries is heavy, so we rely on insects, mostly native bees. So that's important to remember. Water is essential the first year. The blueberries have shallow, tender roots. You want to avoid watering the crown of the plant. They don't like wet roots or wet crown. You don't want to you want to avoid crown rot. So you're going to water by hand. You can use a soaker hose or drip. You just want to make sure it's not right up against the crown of the plant. Um, Sorry, I'm preoccupied with that. New blueberry plantings are going to need 1 to 2 inches of water a week. When you plant, and we'll talk more about that, you're going to prune off all flower buds. Any pruning that you do that first when you're planting that first year is just going to be for the shaping of the plant. You want to set this new bush up for success. You want to concentrate on promoting vegetative growth. In year two, when you're doing your dormant pruning, you can leave some flower buds. But when you plant the bush, you want to remove all the flower buds. You don't want this new baby plant trying to send resources to flowers and fruits. So planting, we're going to be planting in the dormant season, February through March. You can find both 1 and 2 year old plants from any plant nursery. You're going to want to test the soil because their environment is so specific with the low pH. And ideally, you are doing this, it says a couple of months before, but the you want to test in the spring or at least the summer, because if the pH is too high, which it probably is, you can add sulfur, granulated sulfur, to bring the pH down. But this is microbially mediated conversion of the sulfur to bring the pH down. And so if you put sulfur down in January, you're not going to get a lot of um, results to bring that pH down before you're going to plant your plant in February. So ideally, you would be sampling early and then applying your sulfur earlier in the summer. You can only add so much sulfur at a time, so this is a long-term process. Um, there's a lot of information on the web about how much sulfur you can add per 1,000 square feet, and you keep doing that continually, and slowly you can bring the pH down. Blueberries require excellent drainage, so often in the Piedmont they're planted completely above ground. There's a good resource here from Cooperative Extension about growing blueberries in your home garden. You're gonna plant entirely above the surface in a mix of like organic matter and sand and peat and pine chips, pine bark, pine needles, so that there's really good drainage around these new roots. Another thing to consider, which is something I'm considering because I just can't seem to get my pH down and I'm not in enough sun. Anyway, is a container, that's at least 18 to 24 inches deep and has drainage holes. You can really shape the mixture here because you're creating this new mixture. You can plant in a mix of peat moss, shredded pine, or chips and compost. Don't use garden soil. You want something light and easily drainable. But then you can also mix in the elemental sulfur in this container. So, I mean, if you don't have the right spot, this could be a good alternative. Planting the rabbit eyes, we want at least 6 feet apart. If you're doing rows, you want 8 to 10 feet in between the rows. Again, you're removing all flower buds when you plant and maybe pruning down to 3 to 4 canes because you don't want to overwhelm this new planting. You want to set it up for success. You're going to mulch the area heavily. We see some heavy mulch here, 3 to 4 inches with either pine chips or straw, pine straw or black plastic, anything to keep weeds down because again, those roots are really shallow. You don't want to damage them if you're pulling weeds and also hold in moisture. So you're gonna water them regularly the first year. I like this setup here. They're isolated because blueberries are so specific. Their growing environment is so specific that they're in their own area. The hoops are nice in case you have a late spring frost. You could just throw some row cover over that. Fertilizing. So it's important to follow your soil test. Blueberries are sensitive to over-fertilization. In fact, in the year one, you do not fertilize when you plant. You wait until the first leaves reach full size to fertilize. Now, and you're going to use an acid-loving fertilizer. Maybe it says berry tone or it's for azaleas. Now, this is just an example, but what I thought was important here is this is a balanced fertilizer. So we have our 12, 12, 12. And if you know or remember, we've talked about this stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Um, and so if you get your soil test back and it says, woo, you are capped out on phosphorus, don't add any more phosphorus, you would look for a different fertilizer that maybe is 12-0-12 or 12-4-12, rather than a balanced fertilizer. But the key is that you want to put the fertilizer in like a 1 foot circumference around the plant. You want to feed the roots, and you don't want that fertilizer right up around the crown of the plant. You can repeat, excuse me, every 6 to 8 weeks over the summer, depending on rainfall. Um, all very important is you don't want to fertilize after midsummer. You don't want to promote new shoot growth going into the fall that could potentially get injured by cold and then invite pathogens into that injury site. So we're going to do our fertilizing early in the summer season, not past midsummer. So pruning. There's a lot of research out there about pruning. I think I have the best one that I'll show you, but we're going to do dormant pruning. So in between November and March, and again, we prune to keep the plants healthy. We also prune to keep berry size big and manage the bush height. So we're going to be removing any dead canes. The first thing you do when you're pruning is you're going to define your crown. So blueberries have a tendency to spread on the ground, and you want to maintain a healthy bush. So you're gonna, you know, designate a 12 to 18-inch diameter around the crown, and then anything that's outside of that, you're gonna prune away. Even if it's gorgeous, you're gonna prune that away. So you can see here in this picture, these outliers, you're gonna cut those away. You're gonna prune to open up the center. You can see well in this picture, they've opened up the center, taking out any dead canes. You want to eliminate crowding. You want to eliminate canes that are crossing over the center or laying on the ground. You're going to remove flower buds. That's just a part of pruning. It's going to keep your bush healthy. You could remove up to a third of flower buds. You're going to remove any of these tiny little matchstick canes or really long, whip canes that are too tall. Um, there's Bill Klein is it's North Carolina's expert on blueberries, and he has some really good resources. There's a resource here from a video from the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium. There's a webinar here from Bill Klein. Then this last link is to a hands-on blueberry pruning workshop that Bill did a couple years ago. He actually did several where we would take participants out to the blueberry plantings at the small farm unit and prune them. It's an excellent webinar, in-person webinar there where he talks about why you prune to keep berries big, like the growing pattern of the plant, and why you need to prune what you do, and then how to do it. It's really good. I can't emphasize enough. And he talks about when you're pruning, he likes to keep a diversity of cane ages. If you go back to this picture here, we've got the gray canes are 3 years old, the brown canes are 2 years old, and then the bright red ones are 1 year old, brand new. So he likes to keep a little bit of a diversity of cane growth too. So I'll let you guys check out that blueberry pruning workshop that Bill did. Pathogens, just touching on them, we have our fungal diseases. We have our leaf and fruit spot that seems to touch everything that we try to grow. There's a good link here to NC State blueberry pathogens. We want to prune away any infected material before it sporulates and spreads. You can look for resistant cultivars. You can spray fungicides, but remember about the bees. Those are our pollinators. And then again, wise fertilizer management, not fertilizing after midsummer. There, so here's the link to NC State Extension plant pathology that will show you all the different diseases that can attack your blueberry and what they look like and how you can control that or manage that. There's another blueberry pruning resource, and then a Master Gardener link for different rabbit eye varieties. There's a lot of varieties out there that vary in berry size and taste and when they ripen. So if you're really serious, you can have blueberries all summer long if you choose the right varieties. All right, so switching gears to caneberries. Caneberries include blackberries and raspberries. A few statistics about them. Both blackberries and raspberries grow well in full sun, well-drained soil, normal pH of 6 to 6.5, high organic matter content, always a plus. The raspberries prefer cooler temperatures like we have in the mountains. Blackberries can tolerate the heat and humidity that we have down here. They like sandy loam or loamy soils. They do not like wet feet. So you want to avoid clay or poorly drained soils or really wet spots. A raised bed could help alleviate some of that if you have a spot that's wet a lot. Most blackberry and some raspberry cultivars are floricane fruiting, and we'll get into what that means. Floricane means they bear fruit in their second year. The cultivars vary in yields, fruit size, shape, plant architecture, whether it's erect or trailing, and the season that they ripen. Something to note is that you should plant your new caneberry plantings far away from wild populations. There's a lot of wild blackberries out there, but they can harbor diseases that might affect your new planting. So I want to point out before I start that the caneberry production guide, extension guide from Gina Fernandez, who's the extension specialist on small fruits, also does all the small fruit breeding in horticulture science. And then Amanda McWhirt, who's a crops specialist at Arkansas, and Christine Bradish in horticulture science. They have this stellar guide for caneberry production that talks in depth about growth habitat, site selection and planting, fertilization, pruning, water management, integrated pest management. A lot of what I touch on here, I got from this production guide. So really check this out if you're going to be planting some blackberries or raspberries. So that being said, when choosing your planting location, elevation and slope are important. Caveat before I get into this is that if you want to grow some blackberry bushes in your backyard and you don't have a slope, you just have flat ground, certainly go ahead and plant your blackberry bushes. If you're planting a larger number of plants, or you're trying to start a small business where you're either selling blackberries or canning, slope and elevation are going to be much more important for your success. So, I don't want to discourage people to say, "Well, I've just got flat yard and not enough sun," but I would encourage you still to try to do your best with best management practices with what you have. So that being said, um, most fruit crops like a uniform slope that's no greater than 15 degrees. The facing, the slope facing is important. South-facing slopes, they tend to be hotter. The soil's hotter and drier, therefore that has lower organic matter content. They have more potential for winter injury and frost damage, tend to be higher on south-facing slopes. Eastern facing slopes, they face the rising sun. They will dry out more quickly in the morning due to the early sunlight exposure. And then north to northeastern facing slopes, they tend to produce fruit later in the season. So they're less likely to get any frost injuries. So it's important to, you know, take into consideration which direction your slope is facing. Elevation too, frosts tend to settle in lower areas. So an elevated planting offers natural protection from frosts, but don't plant on top of a hill where you're going to get buffeted by, strong cold winds all the time. So slope and elevation are something to be considered. Planting, you certainly want to look at your soil test for what your pH is and what nutrients you need. You're going to be planting dormant rootstock in late fall or early spring. Most types of nursery stock are available from November to March. Certainly this tissue culture plug here, you'll see in a lot of, Home Depot and Lowe's or your plant nursery, but you can order or find bare roots plants. If you're planting a bare root, you just want to make sure that you make the hole big enough to encompass the roots comfortably. The tissue culture plug, you're going to plant at the same level that it was in the pot. And then tip layering. Let's look at tip layering. So for propagation, tip layering is definitely the easiest. It occurs in place. And so this is if you already have blackberries or a buddy already has blackberries. This occurs in late summer, early fall. So between September and October, you are going to do tip layering to create a new plant. So you've got the mother plant here, which you're burying and covering with soil. And then hopefully, after 3 to 6 weeks, this new plant will start to form roots. And then over the winter, it's being supplied from the mother plant with nutrients. And then in the springtime, you can dig up that new plant and its roots and plant it. So that's tip layering, and that occurs in late summer, early fall. There's also, for propagation, there's root division and suckering, root suckers. So the root suckers, caneberries naturally produce suckers that sprout from their shallow roots. So while the plant is dormant, you can dig up that sucker and all its roots and plant that. Stem cuttings, that happens in the fall or winter with these dormant hardwood cuttings. You're going to take 6 to 8 inch sections of the root, remove all the leaves. You dip the end in rooting hormone. A friend told me about aloe, and I tried aloe, just a plant that I had, and I dipped the end in aloe and planted an elderberry cutting, and it worked great. You're going to want to plant in, a soilless media that drains really well, and then put that in bright indirect light. And you can see new growth sprouting from the nodes here and hopefully roots as well. I did not discuss, there's also root cuttings, which is going in and, getting cuttings from the roots. That's less effective, and a little harder, but you can look into that one. Spacing, there are a lot of erect thornless blackberries out there now. You want to plant those 2 to 4 feet apart. Even erect blackberries will need trellising. John will talk about that in a moment. Then there's semi-erect and trailing types, which need more space, 4 to 8 feet between plants. If you're planting multiple rows, you want to give yourself ample room, 10 to 12 feet between rows. There are primocane fruiting raspberries, which you can set those a little closer together than the floricane fruiting types. But we're going to talk about floricane and fruiting habitats. So most blackberries are floricane fruiting. Flor stands for flower. And so the first year, this cane is called a primocane, and it's long, it's flexible, and it's vegetative. No fruit is produced on that cane the first year. In the second year, it becomes a floricane and produces fruit on these laterals, these side shoots called laterals. After fruiting, that cane dies and gets pruned out. So I don't know about you, but this was really hard for me to understand. I found a really good video here. We're going to watch a minute and 40 seconds of this video that it can explain primocanes and floricanes.
Hey guys, Todd with Great Escape Farm here. In the past, I did a video on how to propagate blackberry and raspberry and stuff like that. And I was talking about primocane and floricane. Kind of difficult to explain and a little more difficult to actually show in the dormant season. But now that they're actually out and in full bloom, I wanted to show you what's going on here. So this long line right here, this full cane, that is a primocane. So that came up last year and it grew last year and it did not put out any buds or flowers or fruit or anything. This year, all of these lateral shoots that are coming off of it are new. They sprung up this year, and you can see the flowers on them. Those are what they call floricanes. So that's the second year root or second year buds, and these will flower, and there will be a lot of fruit on them. And let me back up here so you can see. I have a lot of different buds and flowers and fruit back here. And those are all floricane. And next year, this entire cane, so the primocane, floricane, everything that you see here will die back. So I'll need to cut that out. And let me find one. So right here. So this one coming up, you can see it right from the ground, is a primocane. And right now, it's maybe 18 inches tall. It will grow to about 20 foot this year. It will not fruit this year. So that's the primocane. Next year, it will get the lateral shoots like this one right here, and it will flower, and that will have both primocane and floricane. So the primocane would be the previous one, the real long one, and then the floricane would be the new one. So I just wanted to point that out to you and show you the difference. And
All right, so I think that's a really good video explaining the difference, so you know what you're doing when you're pruning, and you don't cut the primocane back to the ground like I did last year. There are some primocane fruiting blackberries, and the primocane during the first year will fruit. Towards the end of the summer, the top of the cane will produce fruit into the fall, and then the next year, the bottom portion of the cane bears fruit. So there's a video here from Amanda McWhirt, who I mentioned earlier, that she's in Arkansas, and they have more of the primocane fruiting types out there, and she will tell you how to prune those. So I think John's going to jump in here and talk a little bit about trellising.
Yes, that is right. Thanks so much, Melissa. And so when we're thinking about blackberries and how to trellis them, um, erect blackberries are also going to need a trellis for healthy growth and ease of harvesting. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. During the first year, erect blackberry plants are going to establish root systems and hopefully grow a moderate number of primocanes. Essentially, you can either trellis them in a V shape or a T shape. Um, this will enable pruning to be a little bit easier and a little bit more effective, which we'll talk more about shortly. But when you do trellis them, you can not only prune more effectively, but also gauge the growth a little bit more accurately. So we want to make sure that the canes are probably about 12 inches wide at the base. And then you want to, especially with the T trellis, V trellis as well, but the picture on the bottom is the T trellis. You want to make sure that those canes go up through the wires. Essentially, you want to also make sure that you've got 8, 12 inches, maybe a little bit more above that top wire. And then whenever you do have enough above it to prune, you can thus encourage lateral branch growth along that T, after which that will be very productive, hopefully, the following year. Um, I want to move to the next slide and talk a little bit more about that two-wire system. Um, Essentially, the thing that you want to really pay a lot of attention to is how much cane growth you have had in the first year, or in this case, the previous year. If the canes have grown 3 or more feet, then you can crop them or prune them in the second year. Um, if there was a small amount of growth in the first year on that cane, less than 3 feet, you're probably going to want to cut it back to several inches or so from the ground. Give it another chance to achieve that better, stronger growth the following year, which then could support berry growth the year after that. So this practice is really going to help the plants to become better established by kind of preventing some of the stress on their productivity due to fruiting. And this method also is really going to kind of help the development of sturdier shoots, which can be more fruitful the next year. So it's definitely playing the long game. In the following years, new shoot growth will ideally be more vigorous. And then you're probably going to have to put a good bit of effort into managing those canes and training them onto the trellis throughout the summer, you know, maybe before you're going to be ready to harvest. So we talked a little bit about that. We're happy to answer some additional questions, but those are two of the big methods. When we think about soil testing is going to be vital across the board. If you've attended any of these trainings, you know how important that is to pretty much everything that we emphasize, all of our practices and all the things we work on. But berry crops are really going to stay in the ground for usually a lot of years, more than many other plants where we're growing food crops in this area. It's a lot quicker and a lot easier to amend the soil before those plants are in the ground than waiting until, you have to play catch up because you've done a soil test too late and the soil isn't ideal for what you're growing. So thinking about how long it might take those soil amendments to react and improve the soil, realistically, we're looking at several months, maybe up to 6 months if we're thinking about lime, different fertilizers. There are a lot of things that are not going to act instantaneously that you might do to prepare that soil for a healthy berry crop. You'll likely have to soil test every season. I would encourage anybody who's listening to try to do it a couple of times a year. We can provide instructions or resources on that should anyone be interested. But for most types of berries, you're probably going to have roots that are reaching considerably more than 8 inches deep. That's not necessarily the case for strawberries, which we'll be talking about next. But even strawberries are somewhat less forgiving of later in the season soil amendments than other crops. So be mindful of that. Be mindful of the root area. Be mindful of making that soil as good and healthy and appropriate as you can for the crops in question. Also, if you are testing for soil, a soil probe is probably going to be your best bet. You can reach out to your local county extension office for some help in acquiring one of those or in getting some assistance with your soil testing. When we think about timing for soil testing for berries, um, ideally doing so regularly once a year. For berries, often cool seasons are good options. So you might choose to do that in the spring or in the fall. Fall is a good option because then there is time essentially for your soil amendments to have some positive effects before you're going and planting the next thing. Seasonal fluctuation totally can occur in soil pH, especially when soils are drying out in the middle of summer and maybe kind of increasing the concentration of salts. So, testing a couple of times a year and getting a read on the pattern of what's occurring in your soil and what you are doing to change it, what those effects are, that can be pretty helpful. Also, be mindful to try to do it before Thanksgiving when it is free. Small plug there for the NCDA Soil Lab. Um, Also, another small thing to reference, if anyone ever is in need of doing a tissue analysis to figure out maybe what's going on with your plant or what the deficiencies are, if there are any, doing these around the same time as a fall soil test can be a good habit to get in, especially if you're a berry farmer. Now we are going to move on to strawberries, which another one of the fruits that we think we can encourage folks to grow successfully on a smaller scale. So when we think about strawberries, we want to think about the considerations. First, we want to think about the considerations for where you might be planting your strawberries. So most sites in North Carolina where folks are growing berries can usually benefit from being grown in raised beds. That's not always going to be the case, but a lot of crops can really have better managed drainage in raised beds. Obviously, folks are growing fields full of all types of small fruit, not in raised beds, but that is a good way to manage the drainage should that be an issue for you and your soils and your production methods. So for strawberries, not, and there are many ways to the top of the mountain here, but a really good way to kind of prepare your strawberry production site is in mounded beds, half a foot to a foot tall, several inches wide, organic matter in the topsoil, as we've talked about a number of times in the past, especially with our soils and our regenerative agriculture webinars. Organic matter is really going to be what drives a lot of those soil microbes to produce the things that the plants are going to need. So we want to be mindful of ideally not tilling the areas for strawberry production after the initial planting has occurred. You can come back next year and either rotate or plant in the same places. But it's going to be also very important that you start with a clean slate and don't plant those berries into where grasses or other weeds are already present. Um, there's a handful of ways that one might produce strawberries, but if you've heard of plasticulture or plastic mulch, strawberries lend themselves really well to successful operation in plasticulture. And I think it's worth noting when we talk about plasticulture that there's a lot of benefits to it, and sometimes there are drawbacks, just like anything else. There is in development biodegradable plastic mulch, which I believe is still a research project that's going on at NCA&T State University. But even while that project is still in development, standard black plastic mulch is a really good way to promote low weeds and healthy soils and a lot of crops, especially strawberries. Berries are going to be harvested 7 or 8 months or so after you plant them. Strawberries, let me be specific. And they are generally going to be transplanted bare root. You might have recently dug out plants, or you might have plugs. Those are the big ways that you're gonna be planting strawberries. Um, and if you are using plasticulture, it does generally enable a higher yield, a sooner harvest, and often an easier harvest because picking those berries can be difficult when you've got little things growing up around them. Um, we can talk more about that if anybody has any questions at a later point. But now I would like to talk about some of the common cultivars and some of the markets that strawberries might have some relationships with or some connections to. Yes, Melissa mentioned drip tape. That's going to be vital. Wa Going around with a watering wand and hitting all the little tiny holes is not the most efficient way. So yes, drip tape is pretty mandatory when you're using plastic mulch. But when we're thinking about common strawberries, the Camarosa, the Chandler, the Camino Real, there's a lot of good ones on the market, but generally folks who are growing around here or folks who are growing either for themselves or for smaller scale local markets. The Camarosa varieties are pretty popular, as well as when you get to a larger scale, the Camino Real are pretty popular as well. There's certainly more varieties than that, but they are tried and true and well tested in this area and also well received by people, including myself. Um, so before we're going to harvest strawberries, we have to be mindful of a handful of things that might occur throughout the year. So thinking about seasonal considerations, not every crop is going to require a row cover. Strawberries definitely benefit from it. Frost protection when it gets really cold, when it's well into freezing, maybe under 25 or so Fahrenheit. That's going to be pretty mandatory to keep your strawberries alive and ready to produce the following warm season. Um, Weeding throughout the season is going to be a big deal. If you're not using plasticulture, which it's certainly not mandatory, and you want an easy and effective harvest, keeping the grasses and the weeds down around the plants regularly is important. And the regularity, the doing it consistently allows you, the producer, to not have to weed too invasively in a way that might disturb that shallow root system and really hurt the plant. So row cover when it's really cold, weeding a handful of times at least throughout the year if you're not using plasticulture. And then scouting for mites. That's a big thing that you might not, if you are new to strawberry production, you might not be mindful that that's a common need for strawberry producers, but I promise it is. And really, really sucks to lose a crop to a pest that you can hardly even see. So scouting for mites is an important thing as well. Assuming that you've managed to get your strawberry crop healthy and happy and fertilized and in good soil until harvest season, then you're going to need to know how to do that correctly as well. So when you are picking your berries, which is how you harvest them, generally hand picking, they can be easy to damage. So a berry harvest is generally a time-consuming thing. To not squish the berries, to not have them squish under their own weight. That is a big issue when you're thinking about shelf life, when you're thinking about managing them. That's an important thing. Also, storage. A couple of the things that I'm going to mention today need to be cooled to refrigerator temperatures pretty immediately after harvesting. Strawberries are one of them. If you pick a bunch of strawberries and they're warm from the sunshine, that can be a really awesome experience. But the second you get home, throw them in the fridge. That's the best way to take care of them. So if anybody has any additional questions about strawberries, please feel free to put them in the chat. I believe Melissa's answering a couple of things right now. But I want to move on to grapes, and in the interest of time, I'll be mindful of not spending too much time on grapes. But the varieties that I want to talk about today of grapes are bunch grapes, as well as some of the types of muscadines, which are a local and regional favorite. So, thinking first about bunch grapes or table grapes, they can often take a few years to get established. They can take a lot of effort. They often have some pretty significant upfront costs to get them to be established and to grow well. And they're not as frequently grown in the Piedmont region as they are a little farther west. One of the most common problems of bunch grapes um, in this area is Pierce's disease, which can be caused by a bacteria that lives in the water conducting cells of a plant or of the grape plant. So essentially, if you do get plants that have Pierce's disease, you'll mostly notice them in late summer and fall, which you'll see kind of a scorch or a browning on the leaf that might get a red or a yellow halo around it. Hopefully, this is not something that you encounter, but table grapes really can be susceptible to that. So, I'm certain that I'm going to talk about it again in a minute, but moisture and air drainage for grapes is very important too. When we're thinking about bunch grapes, also pretty significant upfront costs. You have to do a lot of infrastructural setup to get those plants to be as happy and as have as high a potential as they could have. But that upfront investment usually yields something pretty cool. A vineyard, depending upon how you manage it, can be productive for decades. Um, Larger scale equipment is not generally that compatible with vineyards simply because rows, it is a best management practice, a research-based best management practice to have generally narrow-ish rows between your grapevines. I believe we're looking at 8 or so feet, which um, wider than some, narrower than some other types of crops, but you're not going to be bringing traditional harvesters in for your grapevines, and thus it is often a little bit more affordable equipment wise to manage a vineyard than some other types of fruit crops. Also, very, very important to know your soil and your slope. And when I say your slope, I think I talk about this later, but if I end up being redundant, I'll just skip that in a minute. But when we think about air drainage, if you see grapevines planted on a slope, that heavier, cooler, foggy air, which could, in theory, really hurt, especially hurt a grape plant and other types of fruit trees as well. But that heavier, dense, foggy, cold, wet air will drain down the hill, essentially staying away from the plants. That is a very important thing to do with most types of grapes, but specifically bunch grapes. On to muscadines, which are again a favorite in this area. A lot of good info on muscadine grapes found in the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener Volunteer Program. I believe this picture is one that we got from them. But knowing the type of market that if you are selling grapes, which to have a vineyard or to have grapes on any significant scale, that might be one of the reasons you have a lot of grapes if you're planning on selling them. Um, the markets for the grape types are not interchangeable. Fresh market grapes are not going to be good for juice or wine. Vice versa. If you have grapes that you're planning on juicing or making wine out of, then those are often not good table grapes for the market. Um, Also, depending on what you're trying to produce, there are there's probably going to be a lot of importance around the size of the grape itself. Less important if you're turning them into wine or juice. Um, Also be mindful of cold sensitivity when you're thinking about planting muscadines. Considering some of the cultivar types of grapes, um, there are two different flowering habits which would be important to be mindful of. There are self-fertile grapes, which have a male and a female flower on the same plant. And then there are female cultivars, which just have the female flower and the pollen is sterile. So if you if you're being mindful of how to be as productive as possible, you're probably going to want to plant a variety of both types in roughly a 3-to-1 ratio between female and self-fertile. Um, Most of the larger fruits that you're going to harvest, the larger berries, are more common in female types. But for high productivity, you're going to need a few of the female types to one of the self-fertile types. Happy to answer more questions about that, but in the name of time, I'm going to keep trucking along before questions. We talked about, I knew it was coming up. We talked about slope and air drainage. That's vital. Grapes are very susceptible to cold damage. Also, again, you're probably not planting your vineyards in raised beds, but being mindful of soil that is capable of draining well, is really important. Also, if you have compaction or soils that are prone to flooding, anything like that, don't plant your grapes there. They're not going to be happy. To establish grapes, weed control, very, very important. You can use landscape fabric, you can use cover crops to keep back the weeds. Grasses like rye are great options, but not having a bunch of weeds between and under the vines is crucial. A grape trellis system is usually going to be a high wire system, kind of similar to the T trellis for blackberries. And irrigating those grapes, often or usually with drip irrigation, is really important. They're very woody plants. The fruit is very watery. They need a ton of water, especially in those early years as the foliage is developing and growing stronger. Essentially, your foundation for future years. When you're planting grapes, April and May is kind of the standard. You can plant them in fall, but bigger risk of cold injury. When you look at the root ball of the plant, you want to dig a hole a couple times, a few times larger than that root ball. And ideally, you're going to plant them not on top of your trellis posts, and give them a little bit of space between the plants. It can be helpful when you are planting to wet those roots out, to wet those roots and kind of fan them out like that a little bit to kind of spread them out and give structural stability to the plant. And some folks will use grow tubes, just a small method of protecting that soft, not yet hard wood from damage. So a larger hole dug out with an auger, or by hand if you want to, is pretty labor intensive, but generally pretty necessary for producing those grapes. When you're pruning them, prune when it's cold. You kind of want to balance between good foliage growth, a vigorous plant growth, and also fruit production. So, um, getting rid of almost all of the 1-year-old wood, but leaving 20 or 30 buds, which are going to be your grapes, per foot of the cordon is kind of a sweet spot. Most varieties will like that method, but it really is pretty important to not prune back all of what's going to fruit next year or to not prune back all of the areas that are going to fruit in 2 years. It's kind of a balance, but once you've done it a year or two, you'll get the hang of it. Last thing I don't want to mention before we take questions is harvesting grapes. Around here, you're going to be picking them probably between August and October or so, depending upon the weather. You can harvest them a number of times throughout the year. And then, like strawberries, maybe not the exact same cold temperature, but after you harvest them, throw them in the fridge. If you do that successfully and quickly enough, you can hang on to them for a couple of weeks. So I know we talked about a lot, but now I want to take time, and I believe Melissa has answered a handful of questions in the chat, but I would love to take some time for question and answer for at least a few minutes before we finish up today. And would you mind, Melissa, putting on the last or the question and answer slide where we have our contact info? If anybody wants to reach out to us, please feel free to reach us in either of these ways. Now, looking along in the chat, I see Sarah Collins was asking about strawberry production in Western North Carolina. Um, I would say the climate, I can't necessarily speak to the soils in regard to strawberry production, but the weather in the Piedmont is maybe a little bit more friendly for production of strawberries because those plants are going to be in the ground during the cold, as well as all the way up through, the mostly warm season. So it does get pretty cold out there. You would probably have to be really mindful of good air drainage as well as strong row cover, or maybe you even plant them in a high tunnel or something like that. Um, let's see. Um, do we?
John,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say to minimize confusion. So a lot of people have requested the slide deck in the chat, but that's going to be really hard to follow. So if everyone that requested one could just send me an email, that way, if you don't mind, we could just consolidate it. Just send me an email and I will send you the slide deck.
Also, Melissa, we did gather all the names in the
Oh,
chat for you as well.
okay. Well, never
Well,
mind.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really
So
helpful.
y'all have a couple of methods to reach us, but we'll make
Oh,
sure that.
Margaret. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, S stands for sulfur, elemental sulfur. Someone asked what S stands for. Sorry about that. It means elemental sulfur.
I'm looking through the slides as well. Thank you all for asking so many great questions today. Um, if anyone else has any questions, you're welcome to shout them out or put them in the chat.
Yeah, and if we don't get the slide deck to you via this chat and you do want it, just email us and we'll send it to you.
Absolutely. Um,
Dawn,
and
you've done a wonderful job driving and listening.
uh, thanks. Um, So we do aim to be a resource for everyone who is present if you need anything at all. I see Emma asked the question of does CEFS ever do more detailed crop specific webinars? I won't speak for CEFS, but I know that the webinars that we do together generally cover a number of topics at a time. We'll typically do a warm season crop maintenance webinar a little bit earlier in the year, around springtime, and then we'll do a cool season crop maintenance webinar towards the end of summer when we're coming into fall. But if you have any suggestions, Emma, please feel free to send them to us in email. We always aim to cover what folks' needs are. And then we're continuing this series into 2026. We'll have I should have the dates here, but stay tuned on the CEF's website. We hope that everybody who's present today will be able to attend some of our this coming year's programming. Um, and then Dawn has asked about Chickasaw plums,
Hmm.
which I am not certain if they are dioecious or monoecious. Let me see. How about Dawn? Can you shoot that to me in email, and I'll do a little research and I'll talk to my plum person, and I'll get back to you. But my email is right there. Please feel free to stay in touch. And before we end today, I just have to say a big thank you to the whole CEFS team. Melissa, Daphne, Kurt, everybody involved. I really appreciate you, and thanks to all the participants for being here too.
Yeah, you guys enjoy. If you have feedback, please email us feedback. We welcome about topics specifically, but